I'm pretty sure we're live. Pretty sure we're live. Boy, OBS has gotten a lot better at the whole interfacing with YouTube live stream thing since the last time I used this. Well, people, how are we doing? I hope everyone's doing well. Um, okay. So, what is it we're doing? What is it that you're watching right now? And what are we doing here? What is this thing? I have decided to start a little bit of a live stream series, and the purpose of this series is basically going to be going over books that I'm reading. It looks like I'm blowing my microphone out. Let me try to remedy that if I can. Check one two, check one two. It's still a little loud, honestly. I have noticed that I just kind of talk kind of loud. Can't can't be helped. Anyway, that's all I can do. Um, yeah, we're gonna be talking about books that I read, and kind of I don't want to necessarily say analyzing them because I don't think that I'm particularly I don't think that I'm more qualified to analyze books than anybody else is, really. So the purpose of this really is just as I'm reading these books, and actually just to kind of go over why this kind of popped up to begin with. Um, my New Year's resolution for this year was to read one book per month. Now, to some of you, that's probably like that's super easy, right? Like, what is even the challenge there? Um, but I've kind of challenged myself to read a little bit more often. I think next year I'm going to probably try to do. Um, I think I'm probably going to try to do one book every 2 weeks or something along those lines. Try to get the rate of readership up because there's so many books out there that I want to read, and I always want to try to pack in as many as possible. Um, so, I mean, here it is. John Krakauer's Under the Banner of Heaven. I just finished it today. This was my read that I was actually supposed to finish this book last month. I've been kind of falling behind on my self-imposed readership, but I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I wanted to kind of discuss it. I figured maybe this would be the forum to do it, and we're gonna. I think in this series, I think I'm gonna try to. I don't want to have to avoid spoilers at all. Now, this is a nonfiction book that we're talking about, so um, I mean, I don't feel necessarily any need to kind of like stray away from the events of the book itself, given that they actually happened. I'm going to turn this down just a little bit more because it feels like I'm just like blowing the mic out. I don't know. These streams are going to evolve over time as we as we do them and hopefully get better. The quality of them will hopefully get better. Um, so where to begin? If you haven't read this book, I mean, I highly recommend that you check it out. I highly recommend that you do. It's an excellent book. Um, Honestly, I mean, like even though it took me a while to read, I was riveted the entire time that I was reading it. It's a really great book. Um, I suppose if you haven't read the book, I encourage you just to get this out of the way. I encourage you to read the book before watching this or listening to this or whatever you do. As the format of this is going to take place of like, I think for the first hour or so, I will kind of just talk about my thoughts on the book, and then if somebody pops into the chat and maybe has a question, maybe that'll be the next couple minutes of the stream to kind of just either answer questions or respond to things that people say. But this first initial hour, at least, is going to be just talking about my thoughts. Um, so, if you haven't read the book, It is more or less analyzing the history of Mormonism through the lens of a, a two murders that took place back in the 80s by two gentlemen named Ron and Dan Lafferty. These were the two brothers that carried out these murders, and the central kind of question is the question of the book, I guess, is like what could have driven these two men to murder their sister-in-law and their niece. Those were the victims of the crime. A particularly heinous and evil thing to do. And so the book kind of asks, like, why would they do this, right? And I mean, murder takes place for a myriad of different reasons, but this one in particular, these two murders were particularly driven by religion, theology, ideology, and the book kind of dives into that, into the evolution of Mormonism, and so yeah, let's talk a little bit about it. So we have essentially this religion, Mormonism, that ever since its inception has reveled in violence, has perpetuated violence, has encouraged violence amongst its membership. The kind of core ideas of the Book of Mormon and the Doctrines and Covenants book, and many other Mormon writings over the years, they never really shy away from violence or encouraging people to do violent acts in the name of God, in the name of sort of carrying out God's work. And the other thing too that I think is pretty fascinating is that Mormonism, as I've come to understand it, it kind of operates on prophesying. I don't know how to actually pronounce that, or if that's a word, but it operates on getting transmissions from God. Like Joseph Smith's original kind of conception of the religion was one of receiving transmissions directly from God, and now that came through, I believe, the angel Moroni, and these kind of like gold tablets that Joseph Smith purported to have discovered. And so it never was really like considered unusual for people to say, yeah, I actually spoke to God today and he said X, Y, and Z. He said I should write X, Y, and Z about, whatever the case may be. That type of thing is not considered abnormal in the Mormon faith. And also, I guess I should right here kind of make a distinction that, like, somewhere along the line, mainstream Mormonism separated from what is in the book referred to as fundamentalist Mormonism, the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, as they're kind of referred to. So, while personally, as someone of little faith, and certainly someone who disagrees with much of what Mormons teach and believe, it's difficult for me sometimes to make the fundamental distinction between Mormons and fundamentalist Mormons. But I'll try to, where I can, decouple these two groups, because it is easy to lump everyone into a singular point and judge them on that point. instead of doing the hard work of detangling these two groups and judging them individually. I'll try my best. So, as I was saying, Mormons and fundamentalist Mormons in particular pride themselves on being able to speak to God and speak to angels and command their flock through the use of prophecy and revelations. And so one thing that kind of operates at the center of all of this is that Ron Lafferty, the man who kind of purportedly ordered these murders to take place, believes and has convinced others that he did these murders in the name of God, at the behest of God, at the command of the Lord. And so, in a world where we tend to look at these things as unusual, tend to look at prophecy and things like that as crazy, for lack of a better word, it's difficult to prosecute this man who has committed this murder. Dan Lafferty, who actually carried the murders out, actually held the knife while these murders took place, and Ron Lafferty, who ordered it to be done. It's difficult to put these men on trial for... What's a good way to explain this? This is actually it kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of their trial that they're at the end of the book, and kind of one of the fundamental questions that they come to is like, if these men are insane, as we usually classify people who murder and say that God told them to do the murders, we are essentially kind of invalidating their constitutional First Amendment of freedom of religion, right? It's a freedom that is kind of enshrined in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. One of these things is that you can't have your religious practices discriminated against or infringed upon. I'm trying to get better at public speaking, but sometimes the words don't necessarily come right away. So forgive me if I'm a bit slow on the draw there. But so it becomes difficult. You're trying these men who ostensibly did something insane. They're speaking to God, and God tells them to murder, their sister-in-law and their niece, and you're trying to try them for that. Well, it becomes sort of a defense on the part of their defense attorneys to say, well, these men are crazy. These men are insane. Ron Lafferty is insane. So you can't give him the death penalty. A lot of the argument at the end of the book kind of takes place over is it just a life sentence or is it the death penalty, which is, I believe, still legal in Utah. I could be wrong about that. At the time of the book being written, the death penalty was legal. I believe this book came out in 2003 or 2004, maybe. I think it came out in 2004. So, what do you say there? Is it a case of this man is legally insane, and so he does not deserve the death penalty because of his legal insanity defense? Or is this man totally sane, and he deserves the death penalty because he was fully aware and conscious of what he was doing when he did it. Um, it's difficult to say, and again, it gets entangled into this idea of protected constitutional rights, protected rights for Americans. When people of faith do unspeakable things, are their beliefs still protectable? If a man believes that his actions are protected under the banner of heaven, and that anything that happens under the banner of heaven is not subject to the laws of man or the laws of the U.S., then can't that man technically do anything if his beliefs are protected and he truly under his religion believes that he's doing right? Are we really right to come along and uh, dissuade him of that? Um, I wasn't going to read anything from the book, but I found when I was reading, I think either last night or the night before last, I found particularly, a few particularly relevant quotes, things that I kind of thought um, might prove useful for the stream. By the way, John Krakauer, amazing author. I plan on reading more of his stuff because I think, is just a really great writer, and the research that it took to actually put this book together is pretty astounding. So this is a quote. This is actually a quote within a quote, if you can believe it. I'm quoting John Krakauer, who is quoting Anthony Storr from his book Feet of Clay. And this quote is kind of analyzing gurus and small-time religious zealots who manage to sway people to their into their orbit. This is on page 291 of Under the Banner of Heaven. Critical examination of the lives and beliefs of gurus demonstrates that our psychiatric labels and our conceptions of what is or is not mental illness are woefully inadequate. How, for example, does one distinguish an unorthodox or bizarre faith from delusion? Gurus are isolated people, dependent upon their disciples, with no possibility of being disciplined by a church or criticized by contemporaries. They are above the law. The guru usurps the place of God. Whether gurus have suffered from manic depressive illness, schizophrenia, or any other form of recognized diagnosable mental illness is interesting, but ultimately unimportant. What distinguishes gurus from more orthodox teachers is not their manic depressive mood swings, not their thought disorders, not their delusional beliefs, not their hallucinatory visions, not their mystical states of ecstasy. It is their narcissism. So just thought I'd read that there because I think that something that the book tries to get at is that not only Ron and Dan Lafferty, but the people who drove Mormonism forward, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, I believe the man's name was John Tyler, but a lot of the early proponents of Mormonism and the people who continue to drive it to this day are narcissists. They're people that view themselves as so important that their empathy begins to lack. Their ability to see the person right in front of them for a human is diminished by their own ego and their own will of carrying out what they think they need to carry out. I have a little water here. Excuse me. From the beginnings of the religion, there seemed to be this kind of self-importance to those who accepted the faith, Joseph Smith included. Mormons view themselves as oppressed people. At least they did back in the day, and I think still to a certain extent to this day consider themselves to be pursued. Oh shoot. I think we're back. I don't know what the heck just happened. I think the stream disconnected. I think we're all right. Okay, whatever. Um, what was I trying to get at? Um, Mormons view themselves as being persecuted and being harried at every footstep by um, non-believers. And to this extent, Mormons wrought their will upon the land and upon anybody who got in their way. This is kind of highlighted by I believe it was called the Mountain Meadows Massacre that took place in the 1800s. Essentially, like a wagon train of people emigrating, I think from Utah somewhere else, and I think a lot of them were ex-Mormons, people who lost the faith. Um, a gang of Mormons essentially recruited local Paiute Native Americans, and among them kind of just slaughtered like a huge percentage of this wagon train. I think only like a few people survived. And one of the little girls that survived actually wrote a book about her experience. I'm pretty sure it was called the Mountain Meadow Massacre. Check it out. Insane story. Incredibly persuasive, at least to me, in the conception of early Mormonism as a violent, chaotic faith. And the book's subtitle here, if you can see, if you can even read it, Under the Banner of Heaven, A Story of Violent Faith. There is violence among many of the religions of the world. And I would be remiss to kind of categorize Mormonism as somehow exceptional in this characterization, right? Mormons aren't special in that they have historically been very violent people. There are people of pretty much every faith who are driven to do awful things because of what they believe. It's just especially interesting to analyze Mormons in the fundamental nature of their religion, because Uh, After all, um, fundamentalist Mormonism relies on another really abhorrent practice. I should also mention at this time, Mormons, even to this day, even mainstream Mormons, believe some impressively insane things. The act of polygamy, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is one that they have purportedly left by the wayside, abandoned with the annals of history. But one thing that Mormons do, at least from what I understand, even modern Mormons, non-fundamentalists, believe that black people are the product of sin. That essentially, like, they are descendants of a sinful people that came from Israel to not only the U.S. but all over the world, I suppose. This is something that not only did I read about in this book, but around Mormon folks that I grew up with. This was something that was like pretty commonly understood. That the reason people with darker skin have darker skin is just a natural product of their own sinfulness. Now you really got to wrap your head around that one in terms of if you are Mormon, really wrapping your head around the severity of what you believe. Um, this is something that like I wouldn't I struggle to understand myself how anybody in the modern world could believe something like that, but people do. Um, so that's just kind of another thing to consider. I mean, and this goes without saying, Mormons not the biggest fan of gay people, not really the biggest fan of trans Americans. In general, they're a pretty secluded bunch. Now, you might be thinking at this point, it's kind of weird, you know. A lot of the Mormons that I've met have been relatively decent folk. They usually seem like they're relatively well off. Like there's some kind of weird prosperity that comes along with being Mormon. And the way that John Krakauer talks about this is that, like, essentially, there is no room for failure in life when you kind of have God take everything off your hands. You don't have to be worried about the future. You don't have to have any depression. You don't have to think too deeply about anything, even the nature of your own being, because God's there. God's going to fill that hole for you. God's going to cut off those questions before they even formulate in your head. And I think at the end of the book, really one of the main messages is it worth trading happiness and cocksuredness for your own free will of thought? That if you were raised in a religious sect that believes that the world was created in 6 days, but every science textbook you come across claims otherwise, those two ideas are going to just naturally butt up against each other and clash into each other. And you essentially get to you're on a diverging path at that point. You can ignore the science textbooks and just kind of go back to the safeness of your own naivete, or you can accept some element of what's the word? Some element of chaos, I guess you could say, in order to have the free will of mind to reject the things that have been taught to you for so long, in order to maybe gain greater knowledge, in order to fully understand the world around you. And now I understand there are Mormon intellectuals, even Mormon scientists and Mormon archaeologists and Mormon biologists, like people with a greater understanding of life than mine, who are Mormon. So I don't want to pretend that like religion itself dissolves the ability for reason, but I do think it's difficult to hold both thoughts at once. I do think that's a very difficult task for any one human, to accept the path toward reason without recognizing some of the inherent flaws in their own faith. But I do think it is time to talk about the polygamy of it all. So this is something that, like, even as a kid, I knew was like a thing with Mormons, that like they took plural wives. They had celestial marriages where they would, have a dozen wives and like 60 children. It was kind of a meme of Mormon culture, I guess you could say. That is what the people of this very quickly growing faith did. Now, of course, the outlaw or the act of polygamy, if I'm not mistaken, was outlawed, I think, in like the early 1800s, maybe early 20th century. And the Church of Latter-day Saints, has completely denied any culpability in the practice of polygamy amongst its membership for a long time. But there are areas in this country where conclaves of fundamentalist Mormons gather. One such place is Colorado City. I think it's in Arizona. There is, I believe, Short Creek is the name of the town. There's a few others. There's one in Canada. There's a big ranch out in Mexico where Mormons kind of have been pushed out of areas and into these kind of little conclaves. Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Idaho, Montana. Essentially, as Mormons kept getting pushed west, they eventually ended up in Utah and the kind of surrounding areas, extending all the way, once again, up into Canada and down into Mexico. And in these fundamentalist little conclaves, kind of losing power here again. Not sure why my frame rate keeps dipping there. I hope the stream's okay. If you're watching, let me know if you can see me and hear me okay. So it's important to recognize that one pretty dark aspect of fundamentalist Mormonism is the I'll explain my kind of understanding of this concept. The concept is that women can't get into heaven unless they're married. And so it's considered virtuous for men to marry as many women as possible. And another thing is that you can't have sex unless it's for procreation and unless it's with someone that you're married to. So it is a duty of men to be prosperous and bountiful and create as many offsprings as they can for the coming, the coming of Jesus, basically, or the coming of these angels that are going to kind of like kill the non-believers. And by the way, Mormonism doesn't particularly frown on you killing the non-believers right away. Like, you don't have to wait until that day comes. Like, you can just do it right away. And in the case of Ron and Dan Lafferty, and many other Mormon murderers that have taken place. This book covers several cases where that has been the case. But suffice it to say that this road of polygamy was one where surrounding communities were not very happy with the Mormons in their Mormon neighbors, and reports of not even reports, just the straight up fact of the matter is that a lot of these people were and are marrying their daughters and their nieces and their cousins, and just like the most vile things you can think of, like an 80-year-old man marrying like a 13-year-old girl. Some really intensely dark stuff. And the women that are brought up into this culture are kind of just like, because they're born into it and they're raised into it, there's no real way for them to kind of like break free. They can't. There's not really a whole lot of ways for them to imagine a world outside of it. Not just women, men as well. But there are, of course, some who have apostatized, I think is how you pronounce it. Apostatized? I don't know. People who have abandoned their faith and have gone on the run. And these people often are completely shunned by the Mormon community. They're not allowed to go to church. They're not allowed to attend certain church events or family events. They can be just completely shut out from their own community and their own families and their own lives. So you just kind of imagine like these people out in the desert that are just like marrying children, and I hate to like put it so darkly, but like having sex with children. And if you go against the church or go against church leadership whatsoever, you are just like considered a pariah. And this is kind of the forge in which Ron and Dan Lafferty are forged, right? I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think at first they were fundamentalist Mormons. I think they were just regular Mormons. And then after reading some of the older books of the faith, beginning to realize that they have been led astray by the modern church. This is not necessarily a new thing either with other faiths, that people find different interpretations of what they have considered the truth their entire lives and make it their life's work to kind of make things right. Which kind of, to me, brings up a fundamental question of who is correct, right? If the Mormon faith is based entirely on the teachings of Joseph Smith, and that everything that springs forth from that is considered Mormon canon, why is the revelation that Joseph Smith had about polygamous plural marriage, why is that considered not canon by Mormon scholars and the church leadership? Because at the end of the day, if a faith can be morphed over time by different people and different teachings and different writings, the faith never had any conviction behind it in the first place. It either is or it isn't. It's either correct or it's not. Now, I'm being a little reductive here. I think there are some things you can glean from religion that I don't necessarily think you always have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But if you take something as fundamental to the faith at the time of Joseph Smith as polygamy, and you extract it from the teachings, are you really celebrating the same religion that Joseph Smith had intended, that Brigham Young had intended? Are you even still really a Mormon, is the thing. To me, it's like, can you even still call yourself the thing that you say you are, because you have abandoned one of the pillars of that faith? And this, I think, is one of my main hang-ups with most religions, is that if this thing that is supposed to be so rock solid that I should dedicate my life to it, why does it keep getting updated every couple of years? Why every couple of decades does it get a new rule added to it, or a new, interpretation that is considered canon by church leadership? If this is true, if the Book of Mormon is true and it is the Word of God, why does it need correction? If every revelation and every prophecy that Joseph Smith had, and all the others, every church member after him, every Mormon leader after Joseph Smith, if those were all true, why are you not following it to a T? Now, here's the thing. Historical materialism is a thing. At the time, the U.S. military was ready to, essentially go to war with the Mormons. And I can't remember who, I don't know if it was Lincoln or if it was the president after Lincoln, Andrew Johnson. I don't remember who it was, but one of the presidents, essentially, was getting ready to send the Coast Guard, or the National Guard, into Utah to go to war with the Mormons. They were so disliked by their neighbors that it was considered, they were considering violence. And so this thing that you hold so much conviction in, I think it's silly to just kind of throw everything out once things start getting hairy. Historical materialism is a thing, but faith is faith. And if you believe what you believe, then isn't sticking to it really all you have at the end of the day? I don't know. Maybe it's for smarter men than I to decipher. I want to read a little bit here. This is, again, kind of second half of the book. This kind of talks about Ron Lafferty's case. Because remember, again, even though this is a book about Mormon history, it's kind of centered around these two murders that took place. Ron and Dan Lafferty murdering Brenda and I can't remember the babies. Brenda Lafferty and her baby. So this is all centered around a murder that took place. I want to read a little bit about the trial, because I think this is very prescient stuff, and I think that the way Krakauer writes about it is very not only eloquent, but I think it just evokes some really powerful thoughts. So let's read a little bit here. I'm going to drink a little bit of water, actually. This is from page 297 of the book. The retrial was scheduled to commence in March 1996. Ron's attorneys were left with just a single legal option in their attempt to save him from the firing squad: an insanity defense. The same defense they had wanted to use during the 1985 trial, but Ron had forbidden them to employ. As the trial date approached, Ron continued to tell anyone who would listen that he wasn't the least bit crazy. But this time he stopped short of actively preventing his lawyers from arguing to the court that he was insane. Whether Ron lived or died would hinge entirely on whether a jury could be convinced that his religious beliefs, including his certainty that God had commanded the removal of Brenda and Erica Lafferty — Erica was the name of the child — were not only sincerely held but also so extreme as to be a delusional artifact of a diseased mind. Such a defense would unavoidably raise the same difficult epistemological questions that had come to the fore after the Tenth Circuit Court's ruling in 1991. If Ron Lafferty were deemed mentally ill because he obeyed the voice of his God, isn't everyone who believes in God and seeks guidance through prayer mentally ill as well? In a democratic republic that aspires to protect religious freedom, who should have the right to declare that one person's irrational beliefs are legitimate and commendable, while another person's are crazy? How can a society actively promote religious faith on one hand and condemn a man for zealously adhering to his faith on the other? This, after all, is a country led by a born-again Christian, President George W. Bush. At the time that this book was written and published, it was George Bush was the president, who believes he is an instrument of God and characterizes international relations as a biblical clash between forces of good and evil. The highest law officer in the land, Attorney General Ashcroft, is a dyed-in-the-wool follower of a fundamentalist Christian sect, the Pentecostal Assemblies of God, who begins each day at the Justice Department with a devotional prayer meeting for his staff, periodically has himself anointed with sacred oil, excuse me for tripping on my words there, and subscribes to a vividly apocalyptic worldview that has much in common with key millenarian beliefs held by the Lafferty brothers and the residents of Colorado City. The President, the Attorney General, and other national leaders frequently implore the American people to have faith in the power of prayer and to trust in God's will, which is precisely what they were doing, say both Dan and Ron Lafferty, when so much blood was spilled in American Fork on July 24th, 1984. Just thinking about that really um, it threw around a lot of weight in my mind. It threw around a lot of big questions. If Ron Lafferty were deemed mentally ill because he obeyed the voice of his God, isn't everyone who believes in God and seeks guidance through prayer mentally ill as well? Because I think most people, when they hear that question, would say, no. If you're a person that believes in God, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, I'm not mentally ill. I know plenty of people that are religious, believe in God, pray to Him, speak with Him on a regular basis. They're not mentally ill, right? In that case, if you were to make that argument, you would essentially be saying that Ron Lafferty was justified in these murders. If he is listening to the voice of God, what right would he have to not commit these atrocious acts? Now, you might sit there and say, especially if you're religious, you might sit there and say, well, that's not really God speaking to him, because God would never command somebody to kill somebody, to kill someone. To which I would respond, there is so much of that in the Bible. So much of the Bible is concerned with God telling people to kill others. Or at least, once again, people believing that God told them to do that. It raises, I think, a very interesting question that each one of us must ask. If Ron Lafferty was listening to the voice of God, then shouldn't he listen? If anybody themselves were in his position, they might have done the exact same thing. To us that don't believe, that don't have faith, that don't believe in God, we read this and it's just nonsense. I mean, the idea that somebody hears a voice in their head, and not only that, but the voice in their head is God, and that the voice in their head is telling them to murder 2 members of their family, including a baby. I think each and every one of us can just sit there and say, yeah, that is mentally deranged. Now, of course, that would preclude Ron Lafferty from getting the death sentence. He would at that point only get a life sentence. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the death sentence. I don't think even the worst person in the world deserves to just be murdered by the state because of something they've done. I just don't, personally, I don't think I don't view that as justice. Now, we can quibble over that, or we cannot, you know. There might be some of you out there that are fans of the death penalty and thinking, well, in that case, we have to mount a defense or mount a prosecution that does not argue in favor of him being crazy. In fact, the prosecution has to prove that he's right, has to prove that he's sane, which is exactly what the prosecution did in the case of Ron Lafferty. It's an interesting conundrum because there are these kind of philosophical questions being tamped down by the more surface level constitutional question of is someone's religious rights being infringed because their beliefs aren't taken seriously because of this case, right? And that even that is being tamped down by just the larger question of, is Ron Lafferty crazy? Is Ron Lafferty crazy? I read the whole book, and there are a lot of excuse me, actually, I'm misremembering. There are no direct quotes from Ron Lafferty, at least that John Krakauer spoke with him and wrote it down on the page. Most of the book, John Krakauer is speaking to Dan Lafferty, but Dan Lafferty is actually the one who held the knife, did the deed. Ron was the one ordering it. And so, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that through all of my reading of the book, there was never a moment where I doubted the sanity of Dan Lafferty. at least in terms of his own ability to be aware and be present in the moment and to respond to questions and to be like mentally present. But that clashes so distinctly with being presented of the reality of what he did. Um, it's very interesting to ponder. Somebody can be so there mentally, not crazy in the traditional sense, but is hearing a transmission from God to kill one of their family members, two of their family members, in fact. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you read this book because even after everything I've just said, even if this spoiled everything for you, you just got to read this book because it's so. The history of Mormonism in these pages is so insane, and the way the trial plays out, the way the prosecution and the defense are arguing about these really grand philosophical ideas, I think is just really, really something you just kind of have to read. John Krakauer, great author. I plan on reading a little bit more of him. So here's a little just sort of signing off thing. We got into some deep topics today. If you really liked me talking about this stuff, talking about this book, hit the like button. Maybe leave a little comment. Let me know what you think. Make sure to subscribe, and maybe you'll get to see more in the future. Check it out, folks. The way I guess, kind of like book club of this little live stream series is going to work is that every live stream series or every live stream will be about a different book. And let me I have the next book we're going to be reading. Next book is going to be The Wager by David Grann. David Grann being the author of Killers of the Flower Moon. When I saw this in the store and realized who the author was, I was like, I gotta buy this immediately because Killers of the Flower Moon was one of the best books that I read last year. It was really good. The movie was also great. What is his name? The director of Killers of the Flower Moon. Goodfellas. God, what is his name? Why can I not think of his name? Anyway, that dude. That movie was great. Anyway, so next time we're going to be discussing The Wager by David Grann. And honestly, also, there's probably going to be multiple episodes of this stream within the next month or so because I'm a little bit behind on my reading list. This was supposed to be my April book. This was supposed to be my May book. But here we are, it's June 2nd, and I haven't even started on this. So I got to finish this, hopefully within like a week or so. And then the next book that we read will be announced on the next live stream. I think it's The Hobbit, but I'm not 100% sure. Or it might be And the Sea Will Tell by Vincent Bugliosi. I don't remember it off the top of my head right now. I'm very, very excited to start reading this book, though. Like, I'm so excited to start reading this. So I hope you guys are too. One more thing, just to add something on the end here, is that I recently have been getting back into comic books. Now, if you guys want to see, I guess maybe like at the end of these episodes, we can do a little comic corner talking about some of the comics that I've read, some of the comics that you've read. Maybe we can do that too. The next comic on my reading list is issue 1 of The Immortal Thor. I don't know, it might be fun to add that on to the What You Reading For little live stream series that we're going to do. I'm just about to finish up the Avengers Twilight little mini-series. Very excited for that. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and make sure to like the live stream if you want to see more. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you later.